Let's talk about protein. In a world of fitness, it's pretty much the undisputed king of macros. But man, trying to figure out the actual rules around it, it can feel like you're walking through a minefield of crazy conflicting advice. You hear all these buzzwords thrown around, right? You gotta slam a shake the second you finish your last rep, or you wasted the whole workout. Or, be careful, all that protein is gonna wreck your kidneys. And of course, there's no way you can build serious muscle on a vegan diet. It's enough to make your head spin. So in this explainer, we're gonna cut through all that noise and see what the science really has to say. I mean, you've seen headlines exactly like these, haven't you? They pull you in completely opposite directions. It's so confusing. One camp says timing is absolutely everything, while the other says it doesn't matter at all. So what's the real deal? Well, let me tell you, it's a whole lot simpler than a lot of people want you to believe. Okay, let's dive right in. Before we even think about the fancy stuff, the timing, the types of supplements, all that, we have to talk about the single most important piece of the puzzle. Think of this as the foundation. If you get this part right, pretty much everything else just falls into place. I absolutely love this quote from the nutrition researcher Alan Aragon. It frames this whole conversation perfectly. We spend so much time and energy arguing about the icing when we haven't even baked the cake yet. So our first job, our most important job, is to just bake the cake. And this right here, this is the recipe for the cake. It's your total daily protein intake. The International Society of Sports Nutrition, or the SSN, gives us this super clear, evidence-based recommendation. If you're an active person, you want to aim for 1.4 to 2.0 grams of protein for every kilogram of your body weight. That range, that's your North Star. That's the goal. So what does that actually look like in real life? Well, if you weigh around 150 pounds, that means you're shooting for somewhere between 95 and 136 grams a day. If you're closer to 200 pounds, you're looking at about 127 to 182 grams. The very first step, before you worry about anything else, is to figure out your target in this range and just focus on hitting that number consistently. Okay, so we've baked the cake, we've got our total daily protein locked in. Now we can talk about the icing. Let's talk about protein timing. This is probably the #1 source of stress and confusion out there. So is that post-workout clock really ticking? For years, we've been beaten over the head with this idea of a tiny 30 to 60-minute anabolic window where you have to frantically down a protein shake. Well, it turns out that's largely a myth. The research is actually pretty clear on this. After you work out, your muscles are more sensitive to protein for a much, much longer time. We're talking up to 24 or even 48 hours later. So it's less of a tiny little window and more like a giant, wide-open barn door. And hey, don't just take my word for it. This quote from a brand new 2024 review in a top sports nutrition journal says it all. Your body is smart. As long as you're hitting your total daily protein goal, the cake, the exact timing of when you eat it becomes way less critical. Honestly, this should feel incredibly freeing. It gives you so much flexibility in your day. All right, now that we've got the fundamentals down, let's tackle the fear-mongering. There is a lot of scary stuff floating around out there about high-protein diets. So it's time for a little rapid-fire myth-busting on the 3 big ones. This is the big one. This is the #1 concern I hear all the time. The idea that processing all that extra protein is just going to put way too much strain on your kidneys. But is that what the science actually shows for healthy, active people? The answer is a really clear no. Now, let's be super clear here. If someone already has a pre-existing kidney disease, then yes, restricting protein is important. But for healthy, active people, the evidence is just overwhelming. Scientists have done studies pushing intake all the way up to 4.4 grams per kilogram, that's more than double our target range, and found 0 negative effects on kidney function. Okay, next up, bones. This myth comes from an old idea called the acid-ash hypothesis. The theory was that digesting protein creates acid in your body, and that acid leaches calcium from your bones to get neutralized, making them weaker over time. Yeah, that one's false too. Your body has incredibly powerful systems in place to keep its pH perfectly balanced. It's not that fragile. In fact, the research now suggests that, far from being harmful, a higher protein intake, especially when you're also lifting weights, is actually good for your bone health. And the third big myth. This is a classic case of calorie confusion. That word excess sounds so scary, right? If you eat more protein than your body technically needs, won't it just get stored as fat? The research here is actually fascinating. In studies where they deliberately overfed people with calories only from protein, they didn't gain body fat. In fact, the opposite is usually true in the real world. A higher protein intake is consistently linked to better body composition, so more muscle and less fat. It's really the excess calories from fats and carbs that drive fat gain, not the protein. So far, we've talked about these big, general principles that pretty much apply to everyone. But, we're all a bit different, so let's get a little more personal and tailor this advice for a couple of specific groups that often have unique questions. For female athletes, your physiology brings some unique things to the table. For instance, during the second half of the menstrual cycle, what's called the luteal phase, hormone shifts can actually increase the rate of protein breakdown. So a really smart strategy is to aim for the higher end of that recommended range, maybe around 2.0 or 2.2 grams per kilogram. And similarly, as women enter perimenopause and postmenopause, the body can become a little more resistant to building muscle. So what that means is they might need a bigger dose of protein at each meal, especially one rich in the amino acid leucine, just to get that same powerful muscle-building signal. And what about athletes on a completely plant-based diet? Can you really build muscle just as effectively? The answer is a huge, emphatic yes. It absolutely can be done. It just requires a little more strategy. As long as you're hitting your total protein target, making sure you combine different plant sources to get all your amino acids, getting enough leucine at each meal, and maybe considering a few key supplements, you are good to go. And here's a really practical guide for that. A few key nutrients are just harder to get from plants, so smart supplementation is your best friend. Vitamin B12, that's non-negotiable. You have to supplement. For iron, pairing plant sources with vitamin C works wonders for absorption. Creatine, which is a total powerhouse for performance, simply isn't found in plants, so supplementing is a real game changer. And for those critical omega-3s, EPA and DHA, an algae oil supplement is the perfect solution. All right, speaking of making smart choices, let's talk about food labels for a second. Because, and this is a big one, not all things marketed as high protein are created equal. This is where a lot of well-meaning people get tripped up. You really need to ask yourself this question. It helps you cut right through all the marketing hype. Sure, a food might have protein in it, but does that actually make it a good source of protein? There's a difference. This chart right here, this is so revealing. Just take a look. Peanut butter and cheddar cheese, they have a decent amount of protein, right? But look at the fat content. It's more than double the protein. Now, compare that to chicken breast, which is almost pure protein with very little fat. The key here is to reframe how you think about these foods. Peanut butter and cheese aren't protein sources. They're fat sources that just happen to have some protein along for the ride. And that brings us right back to where we started. So I want to leave you with this one question to think about. When it comes to your own nutrition, where is your focus, really? Are you obsessing over the tiny details, the icing, the sprinkles, the magical timing window? Or are you focused on baking the cake, day in and day out, by consistently hitting your total daily protein goal? Because if you get that foundation right, everything else gets simpler and a whole lot more effective.